The 1968 Democratic Convention, which was held from August 26 to August 29th in Chicago, is known as one of the many important events in the nation's political and cultural history. What was occurring outside the convention proceedings is what made the 1968 Democratic Convention, where Democrats gathered to nominate their presidential candidate, an unforgettable event. Outside the convention, anti-war demonstrators for the Vietnam War was occurring. As the riots escalated, Mayor Richard J. Daley called in the troops. The violence centered on two things: the Chicago police forcing protesters out of the area where they were not permitted to be, and protesters clashing with police and their reinforcements as they tried to march to the convention site. Protesters were tear gassed by the police, and stink bombs thrown by the protesters drifted into the buildings. As protesters marched to the amphitheater, where the convention was being held, they clashed with 11,900 Chicago police, 7,500 Army troops, 7,500 Illinois National Guardsmen, and 1,000 Secret Service agents over 5 days. When the convention was finally over, Chicago police reported 589 arrests had been made, 119 police and 100 protesters had been injured. Inside the amphitheater, tension was also brewing. Anti-war delegates supporting Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern opposed the controlling Humphrey faction, not just over the nomination, but in virtually every aspect of the convention. They challenged the credentials of 15 delegates. Debate over the inclusion of an anti-war plank in the platform lasted 2 days. Although the turmoil would take its toll on the Democratic Party, Humphrey's supporters retained control of the convention. He won the platform fight and was nominated on the first ballot. Humphrey selected Senator Edmund S. Muskie of Maine as his running mate. Many Democrats were originally eager to move their national convention from Chicago to Miami, where the Republicans were to hold their nominating events, because the Democrats were concerned about protest. Mayor Richard J. Daley, however, would not let the convention leave Chicago. He promised to enforce the peace and allow no outrageous demonstrations. He also threatened to withdraw support for Humphrey, the apparent nominee, if the convention had been moved.
Muskie made his debut as a national political figure in late August 1968, when Humphrey chose him as his running mate. Muskie faced many challenges. As the vice presidential candidate, he needed to defend Humphrey, whose liberal and leadership credentials were suspect in some circles after 4 years in the shadows as Johnson's vice president. Muskie had to persuade voters, working class, and ethnic Democrats to reject Wallace. He had to introduce himself to the national electorate, which had little knowledge about him, in order to establish himself as a valid voice. The turning point in Muskie's campaign came on September 25, 1968, at the Washington County Courthouse in Washington, Pennsylvania. When he arrived to the courthouse, Muskie had to walk through a group of hecklers shouting anti-protests. He was challenged by these youth. Seeing this, Muskie invited the hecklers to bring up a spokesperson, to whom Muskie would give 10 minutes of uninterrupted attention in exchange for the same courtesy in return. The student chosen to speak from Washington and Jefferson College was Brody. Muskie asked the crowd to give Brody its attention after Brody proclaimed his patriotism, but denounced all of the candidates and suggested students take to the streets rather than participate in the election. Muskie returned to the microphone. The crowd now gave Muskie its attention. Muskie encouraged them to participate in the political system and argue that history demonstrated that it was inclined to change. Muskie did not satisfy the audience by simply telling them what they wanted to hear. But on the other hand, what he did do was try to persuade listeners to change their minds about a topic or to take some action contrary to their desires. But overall, Muskie's campaign helped overcome the large obstacles Humphrey faced and reduce what began as seemingly formidable Nixon margin into one of the closest presidential races of the 20th century. April 27, in Philadelphia, Humphrey officially announced his presidential campaign and talked about the politics of joy. In order to get his campaign rolling, Humphrey persuaded Larry O'Brien, who had been running the Robert Kennedy campaign, to run his campaign as well as the head of the Democratic National Committee. This left top Humphrey campaign workers, as well Mondale, Harris, and Freeman, wondering about their true role. On top of this, in the first weeks of September, probably no presidential candidate in U.S. history faced more heckling abuse, sparse or hostile crowds, and negative publicity than Hubert Humphrey. To counter the national Harris and Gallup polls, the Democratic National Committee conducted its own polls, which showed Humphrey gaining on Nixon week by week. Unfortunately, time ran out on Hubert Humphrey. Election returns gave Nixon a victory by slightly more than 500,000 votes nationwide.
Eugene Joseph McCarthy is the U.S. Senator from Minnesota, whose maverick anti-war presidential campaign in 1968 toppled Lyndon Johnson from power. McCarthy served 10 years in the U.S. House of Representatives after winning elections in 1948, then 2 terms in the Senate, elected in both 1958 and 1964. The year of 1968, he threw his hat into the ring in the New Hampshire presidential primary as an anti-war candidate, opposing sitting President Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nominations. McCarthy was an extremely erudite individual, and he attracted support from not only anti-war youth but from intellectuals and many celebrities, including movie superstar Paul Newman. George Stanley McGovern is one of the leading liberals in U.S. politics, born in a Republican household. In 1962, McGovern ran for the U.S. Senate. He was considered the underdog against Republican Governor Joe Biden. His major accomplishment was the creation of food stamp program, which was to provide federal food assistance to impoverished people. George McGovern was a leading supporter of Robert F. Kennedy and was horrified by the assassination. He was appalled by the Chicago police force rough treatment of anti-war protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago later that year.